Thank you. Cool. So, Android permissions. In Marshmallow, in case you haven't heard, you do have to request Android permissions. So Marshmallow's here. It's been here now almost a year. How many people are targeting SDK level 23 now? Okay, so some people are still hesitant to make the switch, and I'll go over a lot of the challenges and a lot of basics too, but a lot of kind of the edge cases you might run into in flows. So first thing, there are 9 permission groups. Android has a lot of permissions. You can do a lot of things with Android, but they fall into 9 groups currently. What this means for your dangerous permissions are that, for example, if I want my app to access course location, I'm going to end up presenting the user, or Android will end up presenting the user with a dialog that will ask for location, and it'll be no different than you asking for find location. So again, all of your permissions will fall into these 9 groups, and so if you're going to write to external storage, really there's not much more user experience difficulty in asking for your read external storage permission at the same time. So it's good to keep in mind. Protection level. Android has lots of protection levels. The ones we really care about here are the first 5. Normal. The good news is if you're on Marshmallow, you get all your normal permissions for free. Anything that's just a normal protection level, like internet, you totally get for free. The user's not going to be presented with any scary dialogue. When installing, asking for internet, you just get it. Dangerous permission, this is what mostly this talk is about. These are permissions you will have to ask for at runtime, and you'll at least have to check to see if you have them before running certain code that uses that permission, or else you'll get a security exception. Signature, this is the signature protected permissions are granted only to apps in the system priv app directory, pre-installed system app, and then another interesting one that we'll run into and discuss a little bit is pre-23. These are only free if you are targeting under 23. As soon as you update in your manifest to target 23, some of them are removed, some of them you'll have to do extra flows for, and we'll get into that in a second. So where do you keep up with latest permissions and the permission groups? Yeah, Android's all open source, it's in framework space. Just follow along in master in the manifest. So what's new for my app? Well, if you're about half of the room, I think, isn't targeting 23 yet, you're going to have all your permissions granted by default. You're still going to get the scary dialog in Google Play, or when you're sideloading the system dialog that says your app requires these permissions to be installed. But you're not going to have to ask for runtime permissions. They're all going to be granted by default, even when you're installing on a Marshmallow phone or tablet or device. However, when you are targeting less than 23 and your app is installed on a Marshmallow device, users can still go into system settings and ungrant these permissions. They're granted by default, but users can go ungrant them. And this is where you might run into edge cases if you haven't tested or explored some cases, because you will get empty data. You won't get a security exception. Everything should work, but it is worth testing because you just won't get complete data. Like your contacts list, it will appear that the user has an empty contacts list if the user has explicitly denied permissions. This is where we get into the pre-23 protection level. Again, if you're targeting less than 23, you're going to get the write settings permission and the system alert window, no problem. But when you do target 23, you can't get the write settings permission anymore. If your app requires write settings, you're out of luck. You're never going to be able to target 23 because it's now, I believe it is a system protection level now. The system alert window, you're going to see different. This is for apps. This is for apps that have like floating windows, like Link Bubble or like our Do button or Facebook Messenger. Use the permission system alert window. If you're targeting less than 23, still no problem. The second you target 23, you will have to go into a separate flow, and we'll get into that flow in the next slide. But the user will be presented. The user has to go into settings and enable your app, very similar to the notification listener API, in that the user has to go into the settings and enable it for your app to function with that permission. Good news is that on 6.0 on Marshmallow, the get accounts permission is no longer needed if you only need your own account. So that's a big win for targeting 23. So going to wrap up the system alert window section. Yeah, so the second you target 23, it's not going to work anymore. You're going to have to ask your user to go into settings. Fortunately, the Android settings app provides you with a nice action that'll deep link right into the settings app where you need to go, where the user needs to go, and enable it. And even nicer, it'll come back with an on-activity result callback and let you know to check again. And there's a handy utility method for can draw overlays that just requires a context. So runtime permissions, here's the basics. All the permissions are just simply strings, and context. There's a method on context in 23 that's just called check self permission, and you can simply check if you have it or not, and you're either going to get permission denied or permission granted. Couple of quick tips. If you're using support v4, permission checker is super handy. You don't have to do any version checks, and you get those and cleans up a little bit of your code. Really handy though, especially for refactoring a lot of your legacy code and old code, is the requires permission annotation, which is also in the v4 support annotations. You can just tag your methods with this, and then you're going to get a warning when you try to use this, that method without checking for that permission first. So that's really handy when you have your code kind of all over, and you can just tag it with requires permission and then see what could cause issues. Another handy thing that I guess our iOS friends don't really have is we had the idea of checking if we should show the user a rationale first. This is currently in Android if a user has denied you a permission, and then you ask for it again, then Android will come back and say you should probably ask for a rationale. So after you've checked for your permission and it's been denied, before you ask for it again, you should check if you should show a rationale, and then you can present the user with a dialogue or some snack bar or some helpful context for why you need that permission. And again, that's exposed. It's in the package manager and exposed via an activity if you need to show a rationale. And then the actual requesting, it's in the package manager, but package private and only exposed via an activity instance with the request permissions method. And then you'll get, so this is important, especially if you have a lot of things in the background, and this will be really important to your user experience flow. because you do need this activity. You can't just have a context object. So if you have a service running in the background and you don't have permission, you're going to run, you're going to check the user's contacts and then run some syncing or some logic around that. You can't request permission that you don't have if you're not in an activity. So for us especially, I think we're huge use, or like had this huge use case was in our flagship if app, we do a lot of automation and we sync a lot of things in the background. So the user experience flow that we went with, and this is very case by case, but we provide the user with a helpful notification because users do expect the recipes to run in the background. So if for some reason they have a recipe enabled, but they never enabled the permission, they might wonder why my recipe hasn't run. So we do we do send a notification that says, hey, your recipe hasn't run, and then it links you into our home screen that then requests the permission with some context. But yeah, it's important to remember that you do need the activity window to be able to actually make the permission request and have Android provide the dialogue to the user. Then Android, fortunately, will come back with a callback on after the user has dismissed the window, Android's window, for accepting or denying the permissions with an on-request result callback. And you get a string of permissions and you get a string array of permissions and an integer array of the granted results that you've requested, and then the user has denied or accepted. These will always be the same length. Android guarantees this. I kind of wish that the API had just given us a permission object, or like an array of a permission object that has permissions and granted results, but you just have to manually match them up. They're all one-to-one, and it'll be full of granted or denied. Denied. So what happens when user denies it? Lots of user experience flows you can go through, but the difficult part is you don't know if you can ask for it again, because a user may have denied you. If a user denies you and says, never ask me again, you might not have the opportunity to provide that dialogue to the user via Android again. So it won't make sense to the user why suddenly your button's not working or your sync button isn't working. So I would say good practice, and what we ended up doing, and what a lot of Google literature has provided and encouraged, has been just deep linking into the settings. When it doesn't work, you can provide something subtle, a snack bar, or a dialogue that will allow the user to go right into the settings. You unfortunately can't go to the permissions page, but you can, again, go right into your own application settings, and the user then touches on the permissions list item, and then can enable the permission or not. Yeah, so again, settings provides us a nice action that will give us the deep link right into our own app settings. So testing, yeah, super handy. In case you're not familiar with ADB, you can just shell into your device, and then with the package manager command, you can revoke permissions. You can also grant them, but revoking is super handy when you don't want to have to constantly go back into the settings app manually on your phone and deny them. You can just do it right from ADB. Couple of cool manifest tricks. So you can set a max SDK version on permissions, and get accounts right there is actually a really good example, because if you only need your own get account, you still need that for previous Android versions, but now in 23, you don't need that permission for your own thing. So you can just say, I don't need this on devices with 23. There's also a new tag called uses permission SDK 23. So if you've been holding off on certain features because you were afraid of telling the user, hey, I want your find location. But now you're going to target SDK23, and you'd say, okay, well, the users that are going to get this I'll just ask the users at runtime. They'll have full context of why I need the find location, and then you can just add that feature for 23, and your users under Marshmallow, Lollipop, and lower won't see that scary permission when they go to install your app. So yeah, build user trust, target SDK23. A couple of things that I want to note. That I've been asked before, there is a way to check if your app has, Package Manager actually will give you the flags for a given permission on apps so that you can check if your app has permissions, has all of the permissions that it's declared in its manifest granted or not. Less than 23, Package Manager doesn't expose those flags on permissions, but it does. And I think it's really interesting how Android has evolved the permissions model. Like certainly it was slower to adopt runtime permissions than iOS, but we've seen a lot of different flows that have worked in a lot of different ways, and kind of this build up. We've had just normal permissions. We've had the accessibility. We've had accessibility where users would have to go into the accessibility settings. We've had the notification listener, which is again very similar to the system window permission. And I think the model they've really kind of like settled on is actually very similar to the media projection model, where the user will get a Android system dialog and will be able to permanently deny or to allow you to get a media projection instance. So it's been interesting following that, and yeah, and thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so have you experiment a lot like with showing the rationale before requesting permission? Or is it like, I know that Google wants us to do until they actually tell us to do so, but you know, iOS usually flow with like show a rationale and then just put the.
Yeah, so the nice part about Android is that we'll always get the one try. We're very encouraged to ask first and then do a rationale later, because the user can't permanently deny us in the first try. So that's kind of what I was getting into with after you've been denied, you can link into the settings, but you should always check before you go to request permission on, hey, should I check for a rationale first? And yeah, and like this can be as simple as a dialog that says, hey, we need this permission here because of your recipe. This recipe needs this permission, and then continuing on. And then we're not going to, Android will return false if you say, should I request should I get a rationale? If I've been permanently denied, Android will go ahead and take care of that and say, no, don't bother asking for a rationale. Did that answer your question, or, okay.
Yeah. What are some best practices about when to show those dialogues in terms of user experience? Like, I know on iOS for a while I was encouraged to request push notification access the second your app loaded and launched for the first time. People found that was kind of a jarring experience.
Yeah, so in fact, at IFT we kind of have two use cases in that we have a camera app, Do Camera, that very much has the hey, this totally won't work without a camera permission. So it depends on whether, like the model that Google has kind of pushed is depending on whether it's essential to your app, whether you need to ask for that before displaying any UI or doing anything. It's a very obvious thing. In fact, it's called Do Camera. The user will know you need camera permission. But if it's not obvious, then you really have to ask in context. And but you're encouraged to ask first and show rationale only when Android tells you you need to show rationale, which will be at least on the second try.
Are you totally in control of what the rationale looks and feels like?
Yes, so that is a handy part. So all we get is a simple Boolean flag of show rationale or not, and you, the developer, are totally on your own, for better or for worse, but I think for better, of displaying to the user your full context and explanation of why you need it. Or you could totally, if it's not too important, if it's an obvious permission, maybe you don't need to show a rationale dialogue. But yes, you're totally in control of that.
What makes a permission dangerous?
Yeah, so it's actually totally determined by Android. And yeah, like you just check in the framework's manifest. And so this is like your location and your contacts and like calendar and microphone.
Those are things that you should be very careful with?
Oh, I'm sorry. So dangerous permissions are the permissions you have to ask for runtime. The permissions you're not going to get for free. Yes.
So, are they replacing the current model where like they'll display a list of permissions at the thing, or is it like some combination where you can say like my app is not going to do anything without these, so ask for these when you install, and then you can ask for these other ones as we go?
Yeah. So there's no migration. I guess sadly, you can't say do runtime permissions for these parts and these are always at install time. You have to totally switch over when you target SDK 23. You do have to ask for all of your runtime permissions, but users won't get that big list on Marshmallow if you're targeting 23. But they will get the full list if you're targeting under 23. But there's no in between install list versus runtime list.
What was the motivation initially for you guys to move to 23 and on?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, I think we're like really a prime use case in that our app, we ask for a lot of permissions. When users might only use like a recipe that syncs their call log with a Google Doc, but now we're asking for their contacts and all and to write external storage and their location, but they might never use a recipe that uses the location. And so before, it didn't matter. We'd have to ask for all of that, and if the user didn't like it, just wanted that one recipe, he might just not install it. So yeah, I mean, always staying ahead is like number one, and number two, it just builds user trust and builds user acquisition that way. Like and even if the user's not even scared, like if you're in Google Play and you click install, you don't have to bother clicking on another dialog button. You can just click install, and then you'll get your app installed.
Does IFT or the Android development community in general have a sense of like how much is there some point where like you add so many permissions and like you just get drop off on your installs? I mean, I guess you probably don't have analytics about it, like.
Yeah.
Who turns away?
Yeah, Google doesn't provide any external analytics about that. So yeah, I guess no data.
But presumably some significant.
Yeah,
want to give us their location before they even.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So, say we have some big app that we're moving from some previous version to targeting SDK 23. Do we now have to go through and like find every place that we use the calendar, for example, and like add in this request permission read calendar or whatever? Or is this like a major refactor now to move to 23?
So it is. It kind of is. This is where I was saying that, yeah, like the requires permission annotation will really help, because there you can just say calendar, and anything that calls this, you need to be checking for that permission first. So yeah, you can't ever rely on any kind of global state, because the user could totally go into settings. And then deny it later, even if he's already accepted it. So yeah, every time you're going to make a call, you do need to check for permission. Otherwise, you're going to get a security exception at runtime.
Is there well, I was just trying to think of how, like say you have, an app with 10,000 files in it or something like that. I guess it would be pretty tedious to just run the app as is and see where it crashes first.
Yeah, again, that's where that annotation and the support annotations really helps. Give you those warnings.
So is it the approach that you took initially? You just went to all the cases where you actually need the permission, you put the annotation, and then you...
Yeah, so in a lot of places I did that. We were pretty fortunate. A lot of our syncing was pretty broken up, depending on use case versus contacts versus location and such. Yeah, this definitely helped in a lot of places. Yeah.
It's an example of a system level permission. It sounds like you can't ask for system level permission.
Yeah, so this would be recording, I forget what the actual name of the permission is, but it's the one where you record the system audio. You can actually grant it via ADB. You can declare it in your manifest, but it just, if you make any call to it, it's not going to work unless you from the command line grant it via ADB. But it's a system protected level permission that unless you're in the system app if you've installed in the system app directory versus where your normal app is going to install as the data app directory, then you're not going to be able to access that permission, or you're going to get a security exception when you try to use it.
What's the purpose behind it? Is that for Google created or Samsung?
Yeah, so in that example, the system audio is used, I think, it's used for Chromecast. So I believe I think it's exposed in the settings app to certain APIs that the Chromecast app uses. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Thank you, Eric.
Okay.